Chapter 56. Please like, subscribe, and comment. It really helps my motivation to continue writing this story. Chapter 56. Harry surged forward as fast as he could in his walking boot. Peter was shocked to see that his leg was still broken from before the blip, but he supposed that it made sense given that he himself had come back with all of the still healing injuries that he had from the fight on Titan. But that thought was banished from his mind as soon as Harry reached him. Harry grasped Peter's hand in his before using a surprising amount of strength as he pulled Peter up from his seat and into an embrace, wrapping his arms tight around Peter's shoulders. "Thank God," Harry exclaimed breathily as he clapped manly pats onto Peter's back periodically, but his voice sounded choked up. Almost as though he were attempting not to cry. Peter, on the other hand, was trying to play catch-up as his mind whirred about in circles. His brain had frozen for a second upon seeing Harry Osborn suddenly in Prague, and he was trying to make sense of it all by attempting to add logic to an illogical situation. Peter pulled away from the hug, needing to study his friend's expression to help make sense of everything, but was met with Harry's exuberant grin and red-rimmed eyes. What are you doing here, man?" Peter asked, dumbfounded as he gaped at his friend, still in shock by his presence but also surprised to see the emotional effects that seeing him had on Harry. Harry sniffed once, seemingly annoyed by his unshed tears as he wiped hastily at his eyes with the back of his hand. "I thought something terrible happened to you." Peter blinked up at his friend, full of confusion at the explanation. Hadn't they gone over this already? "Why? I told you that MJ and I were safe." He really didn't mean to sound exasperated, especially when it was obvious that Harry had been genuinely worried. But by being stubborn and tracking Peter down anyway, Harry had caught the eye of S.H.I.E.L.D., which was exactly the sort of thing that Peter always wanted to avoid. Things got messy when his superhero life and his personal life blended. A perfect example of this was what had happened to Mary Jane. She had been kidnapped just because Lincoln somehow knew of his connection to her. He couldn't risk any more of his loved ones getting tangled up in the complicated web of Spider-Man. In fact, he refused to let it happen. At this very factual question on Peter's part, Harry actually donned a sheepish expression as he flashed Peter an apologetic wince. "I thought that maybe. I don't know," Harry sighed and rubbed at the back of his own neck self-consciously, "that I was talking to your kidnapper while we were DMing. I didn't want to take any chances in contacting you over the internet again just in case." Peter blinked up at Harry. The explanation made sense, he had to begrudgingly admit. Especially after Peter had ghosted him for so many days. The lack of word would have been concerning enough, but in Peter's attempt to sway Harry's fears over MJ when they finally did talk over DMs, Peter had only escalated Harry's suspicions. Peter really should have just called him. It would have been better if Harry had just heard his voice as he reassured him that all was well. Instead, Harry had come to his own conclusions. Although Peter couldn't help but be begrudgingly impressed that Harry had managed to track him down at all. Peter wasn't sure what that said about his superheroing skills. He was meant to be stealthy, after all, but Peter could recognize the impressive feat of tracking down a single person in all of Europe. But despite all of that, including his own insecurities as a hero, Peter could see past everything else and recognize how good of a friend Harry Osborn was. He really went out on a limb for him, didn't he? Flew so far out of his way, to Prague, just to try and find him? And not only that, but potentially take on kidnappers just to free them? Sudden emotion choked Peter up. For so long he had only had Ned as a friend. And Ned was great. But he got a bit uncomfortable when it came to talking about the heavy stuff. Harry was like a breath of fresh air to his claustrophobic, overactive senses. And despite his initial shock at seeing him arrive here in Prague, Peter was genuinely glad to see Harry. Especially since it confirmed to his own eyes that his friend was also all right after what happened with the blip. Because Harry died too. Peter sniffed once, twice, and suddenly pulled Harry to him in a hug. "You're pretty paranoid, Harry, you know that?" Peter muttered to the open air beyond Harry's shoulder. A chuckle was heard, and when they pulled back, Peter saw Harry's grin. "I missed you too, bud." Peter matched his grin and they just stood there smiling at one another for a moment, the craziness of the situation hitting them both in the face with its full force. In their relatively short friendship, they have already endured so much. Those sort of things, especially the life-threatening feats that they had survived, set up a bond between people, ones that would last a lifetime. Slowly they both started to chuckle, both dazed at where their lives had currently ended up. Everything about this is so messed up, Peter finally said with light laughter coloring his tone. Right? Harry agreed. With everything that's happened, it feels like we're living in a dystopian sci-fi novel. Except not as fun in real life, Peter added on with a rueful smile and a shake of his head. Yep, Harry began with a dry tone, would have been a lot more entertaining if we had a horde of stormtroopers with terrible aim. The comment was unexpected, but very welcome as Peter laughed loudly at it. Exactly. And there hasn't been one freaking DeLorean in sight. 1.21 gigawatts? Harry cried out with spastic hand movements in a perfect impersonation of Doc from Back to the Future, and Peter had to hold his stomach to keep his laughter under control. If the other patrons of the store weren't annoyed with him already, they certainly were now. They were probably muttering about stupid, rude Americans under their breaths. But compared to everything else, Peter couldn't find it within himself to care. All right. Peter breathed as he finally calmed down enough to speak. I guess I missed you. You guess? Harry asked with a raised brow and an affront of offense before he raised a hand to his heart as though he had been wounded. Ouch. That's the thanks I get for being worried enough about you to track you down? This comment sobered Peter somewhat as he worried his bottom lip between his teeth. I never asked you to track me down, Peter pointed out, still with a slight smile, but internally he was serious on that front. As glad as he was to see Harry again, he still wished that he hadn't gone to all this trouble. Because Peter was sure that there would be ramifications that would need to be dealt with because of it. Yeah. I know. You don't have to ask. That's just the sort of thing that friends do, Peter, Harry said pointedly before his lips quirked, especially when your friend comes from a family that's filthy rich. Blinking, the comment shattered through Peter's defenses. That's just the sort of thing that friends do. After however many days he spent squaring off with Fury, those words were like a soothing balm to a really nasty burn. Because as much as a sobering reality it had been for Peter to learn that Spider-Man may not be all that he's cracked up to be as a hero. At least he could recognize that his Peter Parker side had an amazing support system. May, Harry, Ned, Happy, Quentin. And of course, Mary Jane? His heart suddenly felt really full. Because ever since the final battle with Thanos, Peter had mostly been feeling like he was on his own until he found Mary Jane again, but even then he had been hesitant to share things with her because of all that she's been through. Perhaps it didn't have to be that way. The path of Spider-Man would always be lonely. That was a given. But maybe Peter could learn to take some steps back from Spider-Man and just enjoy the people that cared for Peter Parker. Especially now that he has a new relationship to explore with his lovely girlfriend. He could think of plenty of things he could be doing with her instead of fighting yet another unbeatable cataclysmic event. That meant that after this fight in 2 days, Peter was done fighting world-level threats. At least for a while. He would stick to what he did best, which was stick up for the little guy and fight petty crime. The Avengers could handle the rest. It was their time to take their turn to step up next, anyway. And especially with Mysterio joining their ranks, they probably wouldn't even need Peter anyway. Swallowing thickly as he worked this out in his brain, Peter looked back up at his friend and decided to take a crack at lightening his own mood. Got fuck you money for days, huh? Peter asked dryly. Harry raised a brow. Try years, Pete. Peter was stunned speechless at that, unable to really comprehend how a person could have that much money, as Harry looked all around him, his eyes searching. Where's MJ? Blinking, Peter shook his head before he indicated to the curtain that he had been seated in front of. She's in the dressing room. She lost all of the clothes that she brought with her, so we are shopping for some right now. Harry frowned at hearing this and nodded seriously. And? How is she? Swallowing, Peter kept his eyes fixed on the closed curtain, as though he could somehow see Mary Jane beyond the barrier. She's doing better. Been working through things as they come along. I know it will take time, but she's strong. She always has been. I knew that from the night I met her at the charity ball, Harry mused, a fond smile of remembrance on his lips. She wasn't fazed at all by the bomb threat. He turned to face Peter fully then, where Peter finally forced his gaze away from the curtain, before asking, "Do you mind if I ask what happened?" A spike of panic went down Peter's spine, though he tried to not let it show on his face. He was getting better about not outright displaying his true emotions when it came to things pertaining to his secret. But more than anything, he really just hated that he had to admit most of the truth of what happened to his friend while fabricating the rest. Lying always left a bitter taste on his tongue. Especially after years of hearing Uncle Ben teach him on the importance of always telling the truth. Well, it's not much of a story to tell, to be honest. Her aunt filed a police report, but they were too busy to investigate a case of a person who went missing over 5 years ago when they were still dealing with the aftermath of the blip. Peter swallowed. It was difficult for him to water down the story when he was so emotionally invested with what really happened. It felt almost like he was undermining Mary Jane's experience, and worse, it was for his own benefit. When would his secret stop getting in the way and making the lives of his loved ones so difficult? I offered to come over here to look for her because Mary Jane's aunt is a bit up there in years. I was able to track Mary Jane down by following context clues from the texts we exchanged before the blip happened. And as soon as I figured out where she was being held, I worked with the police and they freed her by also arresting the motherfuckers who kidnapped her. It only held a bit more of secret satisfaction for Peter to know that he and Mysterio had left the mobsters in a world of hurt before the police came to arrest them. But Harry didn't need to know that part. Harry had been nodding along as Peter broke down the official story, indicating wordlessly that he was listening. Do you know why they kidnapped her? Peter fought against the urge to squeeze his eyes shut in his guilt and shame. Because it was because of him that this horrible thing even happened to Mary Jane. But again, he couldn't tell Harry that. From what Mary Jane understood, they thought that she was already an established fashion model and thought that they could extort money for her from her employer. Right. As though her fucking employer hadn't been behind the entire thing from the beginning. But it was the best excuse that Peter could come up with at the time. Lincoln would soon get what was coming to him. Understanding lit in Harry's eyes. Of course he would get that aspect of it. Growing up, Harry had been surrounded by some of the wealthiest people, who also happened to be among the most greedy. Money was a great motivation for someone to be coerced to do evil. Yeah. Well, Harry brightened, forcing cheer back into the conversation. Unlucky for them, it seemed that Peter Parker was on the case and foiled their evil plans. Peter smiled tightly. I'm just glad that she's all right. If she wasn't all right, then Peter would currently be quite the mess right then. Because Mary Jane was quickly becoming the center of his entire world, if she wasn't already, that is. He still had to take the time to confront himself on his own feelings for her. He had an inkling that he was in love with her, but he wasn't quite sure what love even was. It was all a new experience for him, but one that he was excited to explore. It was at that moment, where the curtains opened. Peter? Can you help me with Mary Jane cut herself off, her beautiful green eyes wide, as soon as she spotted the boy that was standing next to Peter. Harry? Harry grinned in relief at that physical proof of seeing Mary Jane alive and unharmed, as he responded in a warm and affectionate tone, Hey, pretty lady. MJ stumbled forward the best that she could, a bright smile on her face as she threw her arms around Harry's neck. What are you doing here? She asked, a slight amount of disbelieving laughter in her voice. Harry hugged her back, his eyes misting again, but Peter could tell that he was managing better at holding back the emotion this time. I heard what happened and I was worried. So I tracked you both down to lend a hand. I'm so glad that you're all right, Mary Jane. Thank you, and I appreciate that thought, Harry, she said as she pulled back from the hug. Then she deliberately looked over at Peter and reached for his hand. Peter immediately extended his own for her to grasp, smiling at the touch as well as the meaning behind it. But Peter is more than capable when it comes to finding a damsel in distress, it seems. Harry's gaze was hyper-focused on their connected hands, before his eyes lifted and glanced between them both as he gestured at the two of them with his pointer finger. Is this what I think it is? Mary Jane turned to look at Peter with a fond smile. A strong urge to kiss those smiling lips welled up inside of him, but he resisted it for Harry's sake. You want to tell him? Sure, Peter looked over to his best friend, only to find an open and expectant expression on his face. And despite it being obvious that Harry already caught on to the truth, Peter confessed to the happy news anyway. Mary Jane and I are officially together now. Well, it's about time. Harry boasted with an exuberant grin. Congratulations. Thanks. Mary Jane beamed as she squeezed Peter's hand tightly once in her own. And Peter's heart squeezed along with the action just from how happy Mary Jane sounded right then. At least he could be certain that so far, He was doing pretty good with this boyfriend business if he was judging off of Mary Jane's reactions. Harry's expression fell then as he donned a guilty look as he continued to glance between the two of them. Man, now I feel terrible. I just barged in on your trip, didn't I? Yeah, that was kinda true. But Peter knew that Harry didn't do it for reasons of wanting to spoil their alone time together. He had been simply a good person that was trying to help his friends who he thought were in need. Don't feel bad. MJ rushed to reassure. Yeah, if it's anyone's fault, it's mine, Peter injected with a guilty wave of his free hand. I should have been more open on the communication front. And Peter felt the full weight of his own words. Because it was his fault. He was so stupid to think that people wouldn't wonder about his whereabouts when he was missing for weeks on end. But you didn't even know that I knew about what happened with MJ, Harry argued back. If Ned never let me know, then I would have been none the wiser. Knowing that he needed to accept full responsibility for all that's happened and its ramifications, Peter sighed. I honestly should have told you myself. Before I left to find her. But when I heard about her disappearance, I went crazy hyper-focused. It was true. The only reason why he thought to tell Ned about it at all before he left was because he needed his help in tracking down information on Eddie Brock, the bastard. But Harry waved him off. That's totally understandable, Pete. If it were me, I would have gone berserk with worry. You did the right thing by putting Mary Jane first. Peter had no argument against that, because what exactly should he say? That he should have put others before Mary Jane? Because if he said that, then it was a lie. Harry must have sensed that was the end of it too, because he whipped out his phone then and immediately started typing away. I better tell the others that I found you so that they don't keep searching. Peter froze. What the fuck did he just say? Mary Jane must have felt the sudden tension from where their hands were connected because her head whipped over to look at him, her gaze searching the side of his face with concern. The others? Peter asked, trying to appear calm as he kept his tone forcibly light. Harry looked up from typing on his phone. Oh. Yeah, I brought over some more of our friends on the private jet to help in the search party. Harry paused at this as his face twisted to himself. Well, friends and some other volunteers. But I wasn't about to say no to their help at the time. Who? Peter nearly demanded while still attempting to quell the mounting dread that he could feel building within his gut. Well, Ned, of course, Harry began, his tone indicating it how obvious that was, and then Betty. Michelle. And. Don't freak out, but Flash also tagged along. Wait, Flash? Yeah. He was actually really worried when he found out about you guys. Harry conveyed, his expression looking as mystified by this as Peter felt. But then Harry's look soured, and finally this guy named Brad Davis. Mary Jane's head tilted adorably, not recognizing the name from all of her past conversations with both Peter and Harry. Peter himself wasn't even familiar with who Harry was referring to as he racked his brain to put a face to the name. Who's Brad? Harry sighed as he rolled his eyes in annoyance at the whole situation at hand. He was 12 years old before the blip happened. He was one of the lucky ones that never got dusted. So now he's 17. Weird, huh? They both nodded. When Peter had attached himself to that spaceship that took him to Titan, he never could have anticipated that it would lead to the world becoming so unfamiliar and strange when he finally returned. I'm sensing some bad blood between the two of you already? Peter asked, able to pick up on some of the context clues that Harry was giving off wordlessly. Harry tried to wave them off. I'm sure you don't want to hear about my drama after everything the two of you have been through. On the contrary, Mary Jane interjected with an eager spark in her eye. I live for the drama. Despite the current predicament, Peter couldn't help but chuckle slightly at her antics. She was just so cute. It's true. She does. Plus, we always talk about my problems, Har. Lay it on us. Besides, maybe it's not quite as big of a deal as he originally thought that they were all here in Prague. They would leave as soon as everyone saw that Peter and Mary Jane were safe, right? With one hand coming up to scratch at the back of his head, Harry sighed. I guess it all started somewhat at the homecoming dance. After you guys left for the airport, I was just minding my own business, but then I caught sight of Michelle, sitting by herself on the bleachers with a book. And I felt guilty for how I snapped at her. Memories of that night came flooding back to Peter. Not only of his amazing time dancing the night away with Mary Jane, his ears turned red as he recalled the way she had grinded against his crotch, but also all that had occurred before she had showed up fashionably late. "Why'd you snap at her?" Mary Jane asked as she leaned forward incrementally with a wide gaze. She was really soaking up the details. It must be really good for her to be able to focus on something else other than what happened in Venice. Harry's lips twisted somewhat as he shifted his gaze downward. He looked a bit embarrassed. She was always calling Peter a loser and other mean things. I didn't like it, so I pointed out the fact that she showed up dateless. And sorta hinted at how that made her a loser herself. Mary Jane winced, as did Peter as he pictured the scene in his mind's eye in remembrance. "That wasn't very nice, Harry," Mary Jane said, her tone soft but also reproachful. "Yeah, it was great to stand up for Peter, but that sort of thing could shatter a girl's self-esteem." "Yeah. I'm an idiot," Harry agreed, his hand movements in the air displaying how exasperated he was with his past self. "But I felt bad enough about it to go and talk to her. To apologize." "Oh?" Peter asked, with a raised brow. This part of the story was new. And Peter found himself just as much invested as Mary Jane was as Harry recalled the tale. Harry nodded in confirmation. Before he bit his bottom lip, a slight flush appeared on his neck and cheeks as he spoke the next words. "That was when I suddenly noticed how pretty she was." Mary Jane released a gasp of delight, the sound of which only made Harry's face redden further. Peter had never seen his friend so affected by a girl before. Even when he also had a crush on Mary Jane. Harry was usually so suave and cool and disarmingly charming when it came to the ladies. What was it about Michelle Jones that was different? She shrugged off my apology, of course, Harry continued quickly, but then I asked her what she was reading. And the way her eyes lit up at the question, Harry cut himself off with a shiver. A slow grin grew on Peter's face as he exchanged a glance with Mary Jane, only to find that she was already beaming. "We got to talking about so many different things," Harry gushed, his words coming out in a tumble now that he really got going, like, "Did you know that Cleopatra wasn't actually Egyptian, but Greek?" Peter nodded while Mary Jane shook her head. Harry sighed in a lovesick sort of fashion as a smile tickled on the edge of his lips. "She's so smart. And she has a lot on her mind to talk about once you get her to open up. Plus she doesn't seem to care that I'm rich or that my last name is Osborne." Harry paused and finally met their gazes head-on for the first time since he started confiding in them. "So, yeah. I guess I have a bit of a crush." "That's great, Harry," Mary Jane exclaimed, finding enough sudden energy to bounce eagerly on the balls of her feet, though Peter's hand in hers helped to get her steady. "You said that she's here on the trip? Can I meet her? How did you ask her out?" "Hold on," Harry said as he held up his hands to stop Mary Jane's tumble of questions as Peter chuckled lightly at her antics. "I haven't asked her out yet." At this statement, Mary Jane's entire expression soured, and for some reason, she shot an annoyed and accusing look over at Peter. Her eyes narrowed at him. "This is your fault, you know. You rubbed off on him." The previously fond expression that he had been giving her dropped and was immediately followed by wide-eyed bewilderment. "Me? What did I do?" With a dramatic roll of her eyes, Mary Jane scoffed as though it were rather obvious. She dropped his hand so that she could cross both of her arms across her chest. He missed the warm comfort of her touch immediately. "Something tells me that he would have asked her out immediately if he hadn't been weighed down for months by your own indecision in asking me out." Peter sputtered. "How was I supposed to know that you liked me?" It was a deadpan expression that he got back as a part of her response as she said plainly, "I gave you every sign, Peter." She really did, Harry agreed with Mary Jane as he gave an enthusiastic nod, a spark of amusement in his gaze as he silently laughed at Peter's expense. Peter sighed, giving in somewhat. But he was going to make sure that if he was going down on this ship, he was taking Harry down with him. "Fine. I already admitted to being an idiot, MJ," Peter coaxed with a slightly crooked and self-deprecating smile as he took a step closer to her and raised his hand to rub gently at her shoulder. She shivered at the touch which had Peter grinning. He loved the physical reactions that he was able to evoke from her. But his grin soon turned into a smirk as he glanced sideways at his friend again as he said pointedly, "But I don't think that excuses Harry." At the reminder, Mary Jane also turned and gave a questioning look at the boy in question. Peter was only glad that he was now out of the hot seat. Being in Mary Jane's good graces was far more enjoyable than being the focus of her ire. Suddenly put on the spot again, Harry's flush returned in full force, and he lingered on a pause for only a moment before he rushed to explain himself. I was confused at the dance. And mistakenly thought I would have more time to figure things out. But then the blip happened. And now Brad is here too? Brad? Mary Jane asked, both of her brows raising up on her forehead as her crossed arms fell away to her sides. What's he got to do with this? A flash of irritation came to Harry's eye as his jaw jutted forward. By his sides, his hands formed into fists as they tightened measurably. I found out pretty quickly on the flight over that he's got a thing for Michelle too. Wincing, Peter and Mary Jane shared another look. Had Harry been rejected in favor of the other boy? Peter honestly found it difficult to believe. This was Harry that they were talking about here. He had the looks, the personality and the money that made all of the girls in their grade go crazy over him as soon as he stepped onto campus for the first time. Who the fuck was Brad Davis, anyway? Especially when compared to Harry Osborn. Man, that's rough, buddy, Peter finally said as he turned away from Mary Jane and clapped Harry on the shoulder in a commiserating manner. Peter's definitely had his fair share of rejection before in the past. And though it wasn't fun at the time, he was glad now that he hadn't ended up with Liz or any of the other girls like he had originally wanted in the past. Peter and Mary Jane fit together so much better, and frankly, none of those other girls could hold a candle when compared to his girlfriend. So, it may be rough for Harry now, but once he meets the right girl, he'll realize that getting rejected was for the best. Hold on, Mary Jane said, her tone commanding as she demanded answers and effectively cutting through Peter's internal musings and assumptions. Does she feel the same way for him? She was definitely invested in the woes of Harry's love life, that's for sure. And Peter had to admit. It was nice to focus on something else that didn't involve him. Especially something having to do with a teenage issue. He sometimes forgot himself that he was only 16 years old, nearly 17, after everything he's been through. Any reminders of his youth were now supremely welcome. Harry huffed and ran a long hand down half of his face. You've never met her, MJ. But she's a difficult one to read. Peter nodded along with this statement. That's true. Michelle had always been a mystery to him. She'd always went out of her way to call him names or degrade him in some way. But there were other times where she had randomly spoken up and defended Peter when up against Flash or a whole group of popular kids. She could be warm and friendly for 1 second and then ice cold the next. To try and peg down what she was thinking in any given instance, one would do better trying to guess the winning lottery numbers. Mary Jane sighed as her face twisted in thought, obviously thinking up a strategy. Well, at least you know that you're still in the game. Of course, MJ was right. There was still time for Harry to fix this. He just had to up the ante on his natural charm for one thing. But Michelle also appreciated genuinity in a person, so Harry just had to be open. Honest. Real. Still, the unfairness of the situation hit at Peter hard as he thought about how Harry was in this predicament in the first place. He frowned and cast Harry a concerned look. Bummer that Brad hijacked your kindness and tricked you into a plane ride over here though, man. Grumbling for a few seconds, Harry's shoulders finally sagged a bit as he sighed. Yeah. He actually seemed so earnest in wanting to help find you guys, too. But as soon as we took off, he tried to monopolize all of Michelle's time. Even smirked at me over her shoulder. Peter rolled his eyes in exasperation at Brad's obvious immaturity. Seriously? Was he still 12 years old? Want me to beat him up for you? Mary Jane asked, much to Harry's amusement as he released some surprised laughter. Peter chuckled lightly too. She always knew just what to say to lighten the mood. I appreciate the offer, Harry said as he looked on at Mary Jane with kind eyes. I may take you up on that. Peter then took the opportunity to thread his fingers through Mary Jane's once again. Her hand was so warm in his, but also so small. It felt delicate while dwarfed in his own. A noise of contentment brushed past her lips as she shifted closer to him before she gently settled her head to rest on his shoulder. For a single moment, peace settled over his busy mind as Peter placed a quick kiss against her temple. He was distracted away from the smell of the shampoo in her hair when he heard Harry exhale heavily. Right. Harry. He couldn't get distracted when they had both asked Harry to confide in them. With a squeeze of Mary Jane's hand in his, Peter gave his friend his full attention once more. I don't know. It seems like she could be into him, though, Harry mused aloud, a visible knot in his brow as he worked through the memories in his brain. He got her to laugh. And you know that doesn't come easily for her. Peter had never seen his friend lacking this much confidence before. It was strange how a simple crush could cause the proudest man to stumble over his own 2 feet. "I'm sorry, man," Peter said with a sympathetic frown, "but if it helps, I think that Michelle has always been good at catching on to other people's bullshit. If Brad is as much of a dick as you make him out to be, then she'll know." Beside him, Mary Jane hummed in accordance with Peter's statement. "Call it women's intuition." "You think so?" Harry asked, his voice probing but also light. Their reassurances must really mean a lot to him. "Totally," Peter said with a hopeful grin toward his friend, forcing as much enthusiasm in his voice that he could, willing Harry to believe his words. It was crazy to Peter how much a lack of confidence was holding his friend back from achieving his full potential. Harry huffed out a heavy breath. "All right." In the meantime, Mary Jane said pointedly as she lifted her head from Peter's shoulder in an attempt to really have her words be heard, "Just continue to be your charming self. And don't call her a loser again in a roundabout way. Or maybe, I don't know, insinuate she's not elite enough to be at a socialite party so she must be a party crasher." Harry flushed at the reminder. "You're never going to let me live that down, are you?" Mary Jane grinned wickedly. "Nope. But I was right, wasn't I? You were a party crasher." Harry probed, not realizing that he would be better off poking a bear than pushing Mary Jane's buttons. Peter could only stand there and watch, both amused and relieved as Mary Jane's natural fiery personality once again came forth, shining as bright as he remembered it being. "That's hardly the point," Mary Jane said with a roll of her eyes as she reached forward and jabbed once at Harry's chest with her pointer finger. Her feistiness was so fucking hot, holy shit. You've gotta just be nice. And compliment her every once in a while, but make sure it's not just about her looks. Peter was nodding along as he tried to tamper down the heat that had suddenly rushed through his body. All his talk about how the fabric of his spider suit could really breathe, but Peter was almost overwhelmingly warm right then. Shifting his feet slightly, Peter purposely shifted his thoughts to the subject matter at hand. "Yeah, you said that you think she's smart, right? You should tell her that. I think that's what she values most about herself. Her brain, I mean." Harry extended Peter with a raised brow and a door look. "Really, Parker? You get yourself a girlfriend and you're suddenly an expert? Wasn't it I that was giving you advice not so long ago on getting over your nerves so that you could ask Mary Jane out? Funny how the tides change, huh?" Peter said with an easy grin, as he let go of Mary Jane's hand in favor of wrapping it around her waist so that he could tug her into his side. She came very willingly, which stroked at the primal male part of him that resided somewhere in his chest. He shook his head and continued on to jibe, "Besides, not so long ago? It's been nearly 6 years, man." Harry groaned and pushed at Peter's shoulder playfully. "Ugh. Don't remind me. I'm still having trouble wrapping my head around that. It may actually be years before they could all come to terms with it. There would always be that question of what if? That lingered in the back of society's mind. What if I hadn't been dusted? What if I had? What if my spouse hadn't been dusted, would we still be together? What if? What if? What if?" "So how did your parents react when you came back?" Peter inquired, wanting to hear a bit more about how people were reacting back home, as he hadn't really had the chance to stay still long enough to take in his environment around him when he had still been in New York. As a part of his response, Harry rubbed the heels of his palms into his eyes tiredly. "It's been somewhat nice. But also weird. And then disappointing." Those were all very contradicting statements. With a sigh, Harry dropped his hands and gave them both a deadpan expression. "Apparently, my parents divorced while I was gone." For several seconds neither Peter nor Mary Jane said anything. The statement had just been so unexpected. And not because Peter presumed that Harry's parents had a happy marriage. On the contrary, Peter had never even met Harry's mom, so therefore he didn't have enough data to judge the situation accurately for himself. But then again, marriage with Norman Osborn couldn't have been easy, right? "Oh, Harry." Mary Jane finally breathed as she reached forward to take his hand gingerly in her own. "I'm so sorry." His eyes got a little red, but it was clear that he was once again trying to tamper down the emotion that he felt. "Yeah. Me too. My mom is still in Barbados. Apparently, her and the pool boy really hit it off. She hasn't come back at all? Peter asked, in utter disbelief, unable to get past the statement about their divorce, let alone the fact that she hadn't yet come back to New York to see her previously dead son for the first time in nearly 6 years. Disgust roiled in the pits of Peter's stomach at the utter selfishness that a person had to hold to just simply ignore their only son like that. Perhaps it was less Norman who was the guilty party in this marriage. Harry shook his head ruefully, and there was a definite tightening of his jaw before he said his next words. I've resolved myself to not care until she does. Peter and Mary Jane shared a glance. But there was something in Mary Jane's eye that almost mirrored the hurt that Harry was currently feeling. What was that about? He'd have to ask her later on. Peter swallowed as he turned his attention back to his friend. And your dad? He hadn't intended for his voice to come out sounding hopeful when he inquired about Norman Osborn's reaction to Harry coming back to life. Never before would Peter have thought that he would be banking on Mr. Osborn to fulfill any promise of hope. But at his question, there was a surprising upturning of Harry's lips. He was over the moon to see me again, which was the weird part in all of this. You know how he acted before? Peter nodded, stunned, indicating that he remembered. Well, he's been so attentive to me lately. And he doesn't give those backhanded comments anymore. As he spoke, Harry seemed just as confused as Peter felt on the matter. He's always asking me if I need anything, money, therapy, a trip away, just the two of us. He said that all I have to do is ask and it's mine. Money is no object. And how do you feel about that? Mary Jane asked. A definite level of unease was visible in the tension of her shoulders. Peter made sure to adjust his hold so that instead of holding her around her waist, his arm was instead wrapped around her shoulders. Here his one hand started kneading at the taut muscles there as an indication that she should relax. Measurably, she gave into his satisfying touch as he continued to massage through her smooth skin. I'm mentally preparing myself, Harry confided, a slight edge of bitterness coloring his tone, because I know that it won't last. Once the glamour of my return has faded, or when I inevitably disappoint him, he'll return to the dear old dad that I remember. Mary Jane hummed thoughtfully, and Peter knew that she was thinking of her own relationship with her own father. Did she wonder the same thing about her dad? That his miraculous metamorphosis towards good was only temporary? That soon, he would hit a roadblock and revert back to his old ways? But anyway, we're all trying to find ways to cope, Harry said purposefully, putting an obvious end to the topic, some more successfully than others. Eventually, we'll have to find ourselves a new normal. Mary Jane added, with a bout of confidence and self-assurance in her tone of voice. More and more she was showing Peter the signs that she was finding a way back to herself again, and that, more than anything else in his life at the time, gave him hope. Exactly, Harry said with a grin in her direction, it will help now that I have 2 of the 3 of my best friends back to help navigate this mess we call life. You're so sweet, Harry, Mary Jane said as she squeezed a hand that she was still holding of his. Peter grinned fondly at them, surprisingly no longer the slightest bit jealous at the innocent touch, when he knew he would have been going crazy with it in the past. But he knew both of their minds on the matter. Mary Jane never even considered Harry as a boyfriend for even a second, at least, not when compared to Peter. And Harry liked Mary Jane, but he wasn't nearly as emotionally attached as Peter was to her. So much was the case, that he easily let go of his crush on her in the name of his friendship with Peter. Now, it seemed like it had been rather easy for Harry to move on from the thought of Mary Jane. Though Peter couldn't see how that was remotely possible. Mary Jane was the total package, after all. Harry cleared his throat then, effectively jostling Peter from his thoughts, as he nodded toward the open dressing room with Mary Jane's choices of clothing still inside. But anyway, are you ready to check out? It will be my treat. Immediately, Mary Jane was trying to wave off the generous offer. Oh no. Harry, you don't have to. I insist, Harry pressed, his tone still kind but was also very firm in his resolve. Besides, I was preparing to drop a large sum of money as ransom for you guys, anyway. So since you're not being held captive, it's actually saved me a ton of money. The least I could do with it is buy you some clothing. It took a second of deliberating on Mary Jane's part. She bit her lip and looked sideways and up at Peter with silent questioning in her eyes. He shrugged at her, telling her without words that it was up to her. If you're sure? Mary Jane asked hesitantly as she looked back at Harry. Absolutely, Harry said with a grin as he took out his wallet from his back pocket, producing the thickest black credit card that Peter has ever seen before in his life. Consider it a "I'm glad that you're both alive" present and leave it at that. Peter grinned. As opposed to the ever-popular "I'm glad you're both dead" present? Mary Jane gave a swat to his chest, one that he barely felt. But Peter's words caused Harry to throw his head back and laugh. Exactly, man. Peter and Harry helped Mary Jane to gather her clothing choices. Peter flushed a brilliant red when he saw that she had somehow picked out a burgundy red bikini without him noticing. The straps were string, which meant that it promised to reveal a lot of Mary Jane's skin. He couldn't fucking wait to see her in it tonight. Placing her selections on the countertop at the checkout, along with the swimming trunks that Peter chose to buy, the register employee began the work of scanning the barcode tags for the several items. That was when the air suddenly shifted. A flicker of his spider sense went off for about half a second and Peter's head whipped over to the store window. There, outside on the other side of the glass, he thought he saw something metallic and silver, but it disappeared as quickly as it appeared. Almost like a flash of light. He frowned slightly at the uneasy feeling this left in him. "Are you still with us, Pete?" Harry asked with a raised brow. It was obvious that he had said something that Peter hadn't heard over the ringing hum in his ears and therefore, hadn't responded. Peter donned a fake smile and turned to face them. "I'm actually feeling a bit warm. I'll just wait for you guys outside." Harry nodded, accepting this answer as he turned back to the register, but Mary Jane shot him a curious look. He hoped that his eyes conveyed to her not to question him aloud on this before he turned and went out the front door, the bell ringing with his exit. As soon as he stepped outside, his eyes did a sweep of the surrounding area as he surveyed for any sign that something was out of the ordinary. He couldn't see anything. But something still felt off. Peter couldn't quite put his finger on what it was, but regardless, the feeling lingered in an unsettling fashion in the pit of his stomach. All that he knew was that this feeling of unease within him felt like he was a tightly wound coil that was ready to be sprung. Something wasn't right. Peter. His whole body whipped around so fast, poised for a fight, only to find Ned running towards him. He only had the time to recognize that there was, in fact, no danger about 2 seconds before his longtime friend rushed forward and crushed him in an embrace. "I'm so glad that you weren't kidnapped, after all." It seems that Harry's paranoia had gotten to Ned and he had come to the same conclusions. That Peter's mission had somehow become compromised, and that he had shared Mary Jane's fate in becoming a hostage as well. He wasn't sure what that said about Ned's faith in him as a hero, but he didn't have the mental energy to delve into how he felt about that. He was too tired to be offended. Instead, he would simply let it go and enjoy the fact that his friends were here for the short amount of time that they would be in Prague before they left for New York again. So Peter relaxed his muscles, that had been tense from his instinctual preparation of a fight. "Missed you too, man," Peter said back in response as he hugged his oldest friend back. "I was so worried," Ned babbled as he squeezed Peter harder. Running up behind him, delayed by only a minute, was the rest of the group that Harry had recruited for the search and rescue. Over Ned's shoulder, Peter surveyed each of their expressions as they stopped in a semicircle before them. Betty had a wide grin on her face as she watched the reunion between two friends with redness in her eyes. She wiped away at them hastily with the back of her hand. Michelle donned a look of pure relief as she studied Peter with so much intensity that his own gaze had to quickly divert and move on. There was too much emotion displayed there for Peter to be able to handle. Flash was another story. And it was weird. He looked to be at a cross between hesitancy and wanting to run up and hug Peter himself. Peter really hoped that he didn't. They were not friends. Hell, it was still a surprise to Peter that Flash even seemed to care. But to Peter, he still saw the other boy as his lifelong bully ever since they started kindergarten together. If Flash was changing toward actually being a decent human being, he wondered at what it was that had changed his tune. The last boy in the group was unknown to him, but by Peter's deduction, he knew that it must be the infamous Brad. He was Asian, and looked to be of Malaysian descent. He was also tall, with perfectly coiffed black hair and a chiseled jawline. By conventional terms, he was a pretty attractive dude. He could see why Harry was worried, but Harry was very good-looking himself, enough to help pull Peter from the gutters of unpopularity single-handedly. So in Peter's mind, he really had nothing to fear. When Ned finally released him, Betty took her turn in giving Peter a light hug. It was awkward on Peter's part. He wasn't sure what boundaries should be set with other girls now that he was Mary Jane's boyfriend. Did she see any sort of interaction with other girls as an offense to their relationship? Even with girls that Peter has known since he was 11 years old? Still, Betty didn't linger and was actually very brief as she said in a genuine voice with tears seeped within it, "We're so happy that you're okay." It was surprising to Peter to realize just how much they had all worried about him. Other than Ned, Flash, and Harry, the other two had never even met Mary Jane officially. Which meant that they had come here for him. And despite how problematic it was that they came here to Prague and garnered the attention of S.H.I.E.L.D., the prospect of how much they cared warmed Peter's heart. "Thanks, Betty," Peter said as they both released from the quick embrace. Michelle looked like she wanted to come forward for a hug too, but she also hesitated. Peter was actually glad that she didn't follow through with it. If he thought a hug with Betty was awkward, a hug with Michelle would be downright uncomfortable. Instead, he flashed her a warm, but small, smile. "Hey, Michelle." There was something in her eyes that softened at his acknowledgement, and in a slight breathy tone, she responded, "Hi, Peter." She looked like she wanted to say so much more, but Peter's eyes then caught on the boy behind her. Only to find that Brad was fixated on a point beyond him. Peter turned around and spotted Mary Jane behind him, leaning up against Harry for support as they vacated the store. Peter beamed at the sight of her and extended his hand in offering. Mary Jane returned his smile as she let go of Harry and shakily stepped forward to take his proffered hand in her grasp. Peter used that contact as momentum to pull her gently to his side. He was so proud of the progress that she was making with her walking. It would be in no time at all where she would be completely healed and they could put all of the nasty business in Venice behind them. Placing a gentle kiss to her cheek, Peter then turned to the group at large. Some of their gazes were wide at the obvious display of affection he was showing to her. Not everyone has officially met her yet, so this is Mary Jane Watson. Peter showed off proudly. How could he not? There was so much about Mary Jane that he had to be proud of. It really did still boggle his mind that she chose him. "So glad to finally meet you." Betty piped up as she hopped forward to grasp Mary Jane's free hand in both of hers. "I'm so glad that you're all right. I'm Betty. Betty Brandt?" "Hi, Betty, and thank you," Mary Jane said with ease, not the least bit uncomfortable having to confront a group of strangers. She was just personable and outgoing like that. If it hadn't been for Peter, I probably wouldn't be. Betty released Mary Jane and happily introduced everyone else in the group. And the ease between the two girls made Peter wonder if maybe Betty could be a good friend for Mary Jane. He knew that she had trouble keeping girls as friends because so many grew to be jealous of the attention that she got from boys, no matter how unwanted that attention was at times. But Peter knew that Betty usually chose to see the best in people. She was the world through the lens of it being a glass half full. While Mish had a bit more of a bleak outlook. "So you already know Harry and Ned, and I think you've met Flash. But this is Michelle Jones and Brad Davis." At the mention of his name, Brad blinked several times and shook his head slightly, seemingly pulled out of his stupor. He had been staring gobsmacked at Mary Jane for several minutes. And it didn't take a genius to figure out why. "You mean?" Brad suddenly spoke up, an imploring and odd look on his face as he stared at Mary Jane, hard. "You're Mary Jane?" "Ugh." Peter knew that look and he tried his best not to sneer at the other boy for outright ogling his girlfriend. It seemed that to Brad, Michelle was no longer within his notice. Was he seriously the type of guy that abandoned one pasture because the grass was greener on the other side? How very vain of him. "Guilty as charged," Mary Jane said with a raised brow, not at all acting in the coy manner that she usually did around boys, and Peter appreciated that fact for his poor nerves. But Peter did wonder if she knew what was going on with Brad's sudden attention on her. With her history of boys throwing themselves down at her feet, he gandered to guess that yes, she did know exactly what was up. He would have to ask her about it later to be certain, though. Brad opened his mouth to say something further, but Mary Jane cut him off and instead snuggled into Peter's side, wrapping herself around his arm. Peter sent a sideways smile her way, very much appreciating the fact that she was laying an unspoken claim on him. "Take that and suck on it, Brad." Mary Jane directed her eyesight to some of the others of the group, avoiding Brad's heavy stare, as she asked in a casual tone, "So when are you all going back to New York?" At this, everyone seemed to look at each other, as if expecting someone else to have the answer. "Oh, come on, we can't be leaving right away," Brad said with an easy grin that almost looked genuine, acting as though he were just another part of the gang. But there was something underlying in it that Peter couldn't quite place a name for as he narrowed his eyes at him. Brad was a slippery one, that was for sure. As if to further this point, Brad continued running his stupid mouth. We only just got here. Plus, Harry here booked us hotel rooms already. It would be a shame to let them go to waste. As Brad finished his little speech where he acted as the leader of the group, he looked straight back at Mary Jane. His gaze was heated and there was a distinct flash in them that told Peter that he knew what Brad's motivation for staying was. There was no fucking way Peter was going to let him near his girlfriend, the fucking creep. None of them could stay in Prague. He had to dissuade them of this idea right away. That sounds great. Ned piped up, none the wiser to Peter's inner turmoil over the unfolding events. Peter's neck nearly cracked from how fast his head swiveled over to gape at him. Why was Ned even agreeing with Brad fucking Davis? I for one would like to stay and party in Prague. Flash enthused, as he rubbed his two hands together eagerly. I owe my followers some excellent comeback content after my 5-year absence. Wait, Peter tried to interject, but they all seemed to suddenly be talking at once, babbling excitedly over their sudden fun European vacation rather than it being a search and rescue. We could go shopping, Betty exclaimed. I want to check out the sights, Brad said, with a slight leer over toward Mary Jane. There's bound to be plenty of romantic places to check out. Mary Jane shivered and Peter tugged her more firmly to his side as he sent an outright glare Brad's way. He got an infuriating smirk in return, probably the same type of smirk that he had given Harry on the plane when he was still vying for Michelle's affections. There's a festival happening 2 nights from now, Michelle pointed out with a shrug. The culture is interesting. Should be fun. With Michelle's input, Harry stepped forward and turned to direct a pained and pleading look Peter's way, silently begging him to understand while also asking preemptively for forgiveness. Peter wondered at the look, confused by the meaning behind it, but didn't have to wait in suspense for very long because that was when Harry spoke up. His voice enthusiastic and authoritative enough that it got the group's attention. That sounds great, Michelle. We should definitely check it out. Cold dread washed over Peter as he realized the implications of all of this. His friends. They would be here, in Prague, in 2 nights. The night of the elemental attack. And not only that, they planned to go out and explore the city that very night. Fuck. 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 Here, he had been worried about keeping just Mary Jane safe, when she already knew all of the details of the elemental fight enough to follow Peter's request for her to stay far away and inside. But now, he had to figure out a way to keep his friends, most of whom knew nothing about his secret or of the danger that was about to come, out and away from an attack that they seemed very keen to walk right in the middle of. Harry, wait. And we can check out the hotel pool tonight, Betty babbled on, cutting off Peter as she gushed over potential plans. Then she turned to Peter and Mary Jane. Where are you guys staying? Yeah, Harry interjected, a guilty look on his face. And for the moment, Peter was actually quite irritated with him. Hadn't he been torn up about interrupting his private trip with Mary Jane just moments ago? I can upgrade you guys to a suite at our same hotel. It was easy for him to tell that Harry was trying to make up for the fact that he had implanted an entire group right in the middle of Peter and Mary Jane's plans. But offering to upgrade a hotel room hardly made up for it, especially with Peter's knowledge of how severe the situation of their staying actually was. We're staying at the Carlo 4 Hotel, Peter said in a flat tone, his lips thinned as he gave Harry a look, letting him know how he truly felt on the matter. But the look that Harry gave him back was strange. That's where we're staying too. Frowning, Peter couldn't understand why that was such a perplexing thing for Harry to understand. Why was it weird that they were already staying in the same hotel? But his answer came to him as Flash suddenly spoke up. How did you manage to book there, Parker? Flash jibbed with a raised brow. Isn't that a bit out of your price range? Understanding was like a bucket of cold water poured over his head. Internal panic gripped at him for a moment. He had to think of an answer, quick. Oh, Peter, stop being modest. Mary Jane interjected with a light slap on his bicep and a grin that displayed pride. Ain't him. She turned to the group at large and spoke to them as though she were disclosing a fascinating secret. He just used some of the old connections that he had at SI. Apparently, there are a few people there that owe him some favors from when he was interning there and they pulled some strings for us. Peter released a heavy sigh of relief, though the mention of Stark Industries caused his heart to ache. Ned flashed Peter a look, knowing that all of that was a lie, but he had no clue as to what the actual truth was. Peter would make sure to fill him in later. If only Ned already knew the truth and didn't play an active part in agreeing that they all stay. It was strange though, because Harry almost looked hurt from this brilliant fabrication on Mary Jane's part. "You could have just asked me, Pete. I would have hooked you guys up with the presidential suite." It was even stranger that Peter actually felt guilt from his friend's statement. What exactly did he have to feel guilty for? The answer was a whisper in the back of his mind, sounding suspiciously like Uncle Ben's voice, reminding him of the dangers of lies. "We didn't want to be a bother, honest," Peter said, his tone light but his smile was terse as he fought to remain casual. "We were actually going to rough it with the hostiles, but the opportunity just came out of nowhere, so we jumped on it." Harry seemed to accept this answer as he shrugged one shoulder and then turned to address the group at large, his gaze especially focused on Michelle Jones. "Then it's settled. We're all staying. My treat. We all deserve a vacation after the hell of the last 5 years." Sounds of excitement escaped everyone as Peter watched on with a tight-lipped smile. All the while, he was screaming with frustration and desperation inside. He gripped tight to Mary Jane's hand, suddenly needing to borrow some of her strength. Because the next couple of days were going to be hell. I just can't give poor Peter a break, can I? But the drama is mounting as more stakes are added. Thank you all so much for reading. Please vote and leave a comment below and let me know your thoughts. I promise you that comments help to motivate me to write faster.